Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I hope you're all having an educational, informative, interesting series of talks and dialogues as part of this fellowship. What I'm going to focus on for the next hour or so is the kind of work that we do in my lab. This is a non-invasive brain stimulation. I'll focus mostly on transcranial magnetic stimulation and what's called direct current stimulation, so electrical stimulation of the brain. Let me give you this caveat. I mean, you just heard my educational background. I am a clinical behavioral neurologist and researcher in non-invasive brain stimulation. I'm not a neuroethicist by training. However, I do think that a lot of the work that individuals in cognitive neuroscience who do brain stimulation, a lot of the work that we do touches on neuroethics, in particular this growing field of cognitive enhancement. So thank you again for inviting me to speak on this topic, and I hope you find that this touches on areas that you were specifically interested in. This is our roadmap for today, and so I've divided it up into the primer, the promise, and the peril of non-invasive brain stimulation, right? So first, the primer. For those of you who aren't familiar with transcranial magnetic or transcranial direct current stimulation, we will talk a little bit about what those are, just sort of a thumbnail sketch of each of those technologies. Then we'll talk a little bit about the promise of these technologies with respect to cognitive enhancement. And here I'll take the sort of shotgun / smorgasbord approach, just sort of a quick smattering of a lot of different areas of cognition where work has been done demonstrating that potentially these non-invasive brain stimulation techniques can be used to enhance different aspects of human performance. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what I see, at least, as some of the potential perils of using non-invasive brain stimulation. And here, I think we'll open up to a dialogue, and I'm expected to be as informed by you as hopefully you are informed by me when I'm talking about these other areas, about what you perceive as some of the potential advantages, disadvantages, and perils of technologies like these. So again, the primer, and then the promise, and then the perils. So TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So have most of you heard of this technology? All right. So just to explain it in a nutshell, it's based on a very old idea, that being the idea of electromagnetic induction, what is sometimes referred to as the Faraday principle, discovered by Michael Faraday in the 19th century. The basic idea is that if you have a coil of wire and then you rapidly pass current through it, what you effectively create in that moment in time, in that instant, is an electromagnet. Right, as you're going from zero to full current back to zero, you have a flux in the field strength of that magnetic field that you're generating. If you then have a second body that is a conductive body and you place it somewhere in the vicinity of the fluxing magnetic field, you will generate current in that second body as the magnetic field fluxes in its strength, even if that second body is not actually physically touching the one through which you are passing the initial current. All right, so this is induced electrical current at a distance. And so for our purposes, the coil is a coil of wire, but the conductive body of interest is the underlying neurons of the brain, right? So we place this in close opposition to the scalp, and then we discharge it, and as the magnetic field fluxes, right, it creates current in underlying neurons, sufficient current to actually cause them to depolarize, right, and to fire off their action potentials. And that's the basic premise and idea behind transcranial magnetic stimulation. So the obvious advantage of this technology, it's been around since the mid-'80s, but the obvious advantage of the technology is that it's non-invasive, right, as opposed to what we were comparing it to in the past, sort of actual stimulation of the brain, Wilder Penfield with an electrode in neurosurgery, sort of actually tapping the brain with an electrode. This is completely non-invasive, it's from the outside. And also, it's focal, right? A little bit later in the day, you'll be taken down to our lab and given a tour, and you'll see a TMS unit. And you can see that the coil, the business end of the unit's about yay big, and you can sort of move it all over the head. And so you have a certain degree of focality with which you can stimulate the brain. So here's an example of what a typical setup would look like. And this equipment will be familiar to you. Looking at it now, when you go downstairs, you're going to see a lot of this So this is a modern TMS setup. You've got a coil, a subject is seated in some setup. We happen to use a chair that's actually a barber's chair because they find it comfortable, but some kind of setup. And many investigators these days will use a neuronavigational tracking system. Again, this sort of speaks to the focal nature of the stimulation. Right? We think that the stimulation is focal to the point that the area of maximal stimulation is within the range of 1 to 2 centimeters squared at the cortical surface. So you need a pretty exact way of knowing where you're going. So we use these neuronavigational systems where we enter structural MRI data that allows us to target our stimulation to what we think is on the order of millimeter accuracy and precision when we're stimulating brain areas. So again, the advantages of TMS allows you to focally, non-invasively manipulate brain activity to the point that you actually cause brain areas, neurons, to fire, to discharge. And so depending on how you're administering the stimulation with respect to frequency, intensity, duration, you can actually use this technology to focally increase cortical activity in a region or focally suppress activity in a region. Often for the purposes of cognitive neuroscience with transient effects, but for our purposes, there is also data demonstrating that you can have more enduring effects. Transcranial direct current stimulation. Remember I told you that the scientific explanation for transcranial magnetic stimulation was simple. The scientific explanation for transcranial direct current stimulation on some level is even more elemental, right? So basically what you're doing is you're taking a couple of electrodes, you're placing them on the scalp, and then you're running current through them with the idea that some of that current is going to run through the brain. Right? And since the brain works via electrochemical properties, right, it has membrane potentials, and if you can change those electrochemical properties, if you can change that membrane potential, you will change the firing patterns of the brain. That's the basic idea behind transcranial direct current stimulation. Now, unlike transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we think that the intensity of the stimulation is sufficient to cause those neurons that you're stimulating to depolarize at the moment that you're giving the pulse, transcranial direct current stimulation, the intensity of stimulation that you're giving is much weaker. The current that we're running is on the order of 1 to 2 milliamps. This tiny, tiny current. It's comparable to basically hooking yourself up to a 9-volt battery. So it's a very weak current. However, what we think is happening is that it induces incremental shifts in what's called the membrane potential, the sort of the resting states of neurons. And if you induce these incremental changes, then over a period of time, the likelihood that a neuron or a population of neurons is going to fire can be increased slightly or decreased slightly. And that apparently is sufficient to induce changes in relevant behaviors, changes in behaviors related to the area of the brain that you are stimulating. Right? So unlike TMS, it's not neurostimulation. Technically, we call it neuromodulation. I'll show you a slide related to that in a second. So the received lore about transcranial direct current stimulation, although you'll find people who argue this point, is that you can get different effects depending on which polarity of electrode you are using over a specific area of the brain, where in a number of studies, anodal stimulation, right, one of the electrodes, the anode, has been associated with more facilitative effects, and cathodal stimulation, when applied over the brain, has been more frequently associated with inhibitory effects, although you can find some literature that sort of belies that, but that's sort of the received wisdom. Advantages of this technology: it's very safe. TMS is also safe within currently published safety parameters, but to date, no one has actually demonstrated any long-term serious adverse effects of tDCS. It is also non-invasive, as you can tell, and we call it painless. Some subjects will report some itching, tingling. They might report that if at the somewhat higher intensities that it's slightly uncomfortable, but it certainly doesn't range to typically into the realm of frank pain for most subjects who receive it. So what this slide illustrates is what I like to think of as the thought space of non-invasive brain stimulation. Another way of thinking this is in terms of our investigative devices and our our neural techniques for evaluating brain activity and structure and function, where does brain stimulation fit in? Now this slide's somewhat old, so it only covers TMS, but we can sort of imagine where tDCS would fit into it as well. So what I've illustrated, or what I'm borrowing from this particular paper, what's illustrated on the x-axis is spatial resolution of your techniques. What's illustrated on the y-axis is the temporal resolution of your technique. So in other words, you could have a technique like ERP, EEG, MEG, neurophysiologic techniques, which are very exact with respect to your timing, right? You know when a signal is coming from the brain in EEG or ERP, but not so great with respect to the spatial, where'd I go? The spatial resolution of the technique in terms of getting down to molecules, synapses, and cells. Conversely, our imaging techniques tend to be pretty good with respect, or at least better than some of our neurophysiologic techniques with regards to the spatial resolution, how well they're able to resolve spatial differences in the brain, but perhaps a little weaker with respect to their ability to resolve temporal differences in the brain, temporal changes. So TMS would fit somewhere here. It has something analogous to the spatial resolution of our imaging techniques, but also since you can control when exactly you're giving the pulses, right, you can, at least in an investigative setting, have pretty good temporal resolution with respect to when things are happening. Right? But the key difference, and this is something, throwing the tDCS into the mix, the key difference on this graph is actually going into and out of the board, the three-dimensional aspect of this particular figure, right? Because what that's meant to represent is the difference between correlation and what I'm going to refer to as causation, or at least steps towards causation. Right? So when you're looking at fMRI data or EEG data or some other type of investigative technique, you're looking at correlative data. You have some behavioral task. The person does the task. You note some change in brain activity, right? And then you correlate the change in the brain activity with the performance of the task. It's a correlational technique, as opposed to brain stimulation, where you are exogenously, focally manipulating the nature, right, the function of the brain, and then seeing what that manipulation does to subsequent behaviors. And you understand the fundamental difference between how these techniques work in terms of what information you're deriving. So, as I said before, you can sort of think about different categories of manipulation. TMS can be used to actually acutely stimulate depolarized neurons, and then with continued use, you do see modulatory effects, or broader, longer-lasting effects in brain activity, and we'll talk about that in the context of enhancement. tDCS we typically think of as a neuromodulatory technique. We don't flip on the switch and then suddenly find action potentials as a result of tDCS. And as I said before, both techniques can be used to inhibit or facilitate brain activity. So this very busy, noisy slide just provides a bit of comparison. I've already talked about most of these comparisons, so I'm not going to read the slide to you. Between these two technologies, which at least on the surface of things people might interpret as being similar. So I just wanted to point out some of the similarities and differences. We typically think of TMS as having better temporal resolution. When you stimulate, you know that the action potentials, the changes are happening at the time that you're stimulating, whereas tDCS is given over the course of minutes, and we assume that the change is more subtle. TMS typically has better spatial resolution. The duration of effects, well, we'll talk about studies where the duration of effects that are induced can either be acute or seemingly can last for days or weeks, really for both technologies. Because TMS has been around longer, there's a little bit more data for it. Ease of localization. So this is a sort of two-edged sword. So for conventional tDCS, and I say conventional because these days so-called high-definition systems are being invented that are supposed to have better spatial resolution. But for the type of tDCS that most people are doing, the spatial resolution is kind of poor, right? You stick a couple of electrodes on the brain, you run current through it, and you hope that the current runs through the section of brain that you're interested in stimulating, but it probably runs through a lot more than just that. Right? So that's not great spatial resolution. So the disadvantage of that is if you're interested in only stimulating one particular area, or if you're interested in not stimulating some particular area, it's kind of difficult sometimes to know exactly what's going on with tDCS compared to TMS. The advantage, however, for tDCS in this regard is, well, if you don't have a specific idea of one particular site you're trying to hit, or if you've got a network of areas that you're trying to go after, well, maybe this is the right technology for you. And also, if you're doing TMS, if you wanted to be that exact about where you were stimulating, you might be interested in using neuronavigational software or hardware, which will run you yet another, say, $50,000. So, there are expenses and sort of also theoretical reasons why you might want a technology that's a little bit lower resolution than a technology that's a little higher resolution. And of course, there are reasons for the opposite as well. They're both very safe. As I told you, TMS, it's safe within its currently applied parameters. There have been some cases of seizures. It's a main risk. tDCS, no one's ever demonstrated any long-term adverse outcomes to date. We talked a little bit about patient discomfort. I told you about tDCS. For TMS, you have to remember that since you're acutely stimulating, you're creating action potentials, you can also do that over the nerves that innervate muscle, right, including your scalp muscles. So it's very typical that you get some twitching of the scalp and of the facial muscles, depending on where you're stimulating. Some subjects find that somewhat uncomfortable. An important difference between the two in research studies is the ability to use a sham control. So one of the nice things about tDCS, direct current stimulation, is that most individuals, when you turn on the unit, they get this sort of itching feeling, it's maybe a tingling, or some might describe it as a burning, but they often habituate to it over the course of seconds to minutes, right? So that very quickly that feeling fades to some extent. And for many of them, fades to the point that they're not really focusing on it as they're doing their task. So a nice sham that you can administer is one in which during that period of habituation, when they feel that sensation is diminishing, you are actually gradually turning down the current until it's not on anymore, right? And at least at some lower intensities, subjects can't really distinguish this from real stimulation. And so that's nice compared to TMS, where you can have coils that make the same sounds as TMS, that look just like active TMS coils, but you know the difference often between being stimulated and being not stimulated, often by virtue of that thing I said about patient comfort or discomfort, where when you're getting stimulated, your face will twitch, you'll have that sort of tapping sensation on your scalp. You don't get that often with these sham coils. So tDCS is somewhat easier to placebo control, if you will, than TMS. tDCS wins hands down with respect to portability and ease of use. TMS, you'll see the setup involves a rack like this, and then we have our navigational hardware, and then a couple of computers to run the whole setup. tDCS, I could fit into my attaché case. Right? It's smaller than a bread box, however you want to describe it, and for those reasons, you can also pair it with therapies. You sort of wear the electrodes while you're doing other things with TMS because of the need to have high spatial resolution. You're usually holding the head pretty still. So there's a certain flexibility of use and ease of use with tDCS versus TMS. And then finally, there's a sort of order of magnitude difference in the cost. You can imagine the whole setup, the rigging that we'll show you downstairs will run you a pretty penny more than a tDCS unit. All right, so that is sort of an introduction to the two techniques, and we can talk more. I didn't sort of delve too much into the neurophysiology of the techniques. If that's something that is of interest to you, we can talk about them in a little bit. But I do want to give you an overview of some of the experiments that have been done looking at how these two techniques can be used to modify cognition. And so here, we'll focus on a few areas: language, learning and memory, spatial attention, something that's been gaining a lot of traction in the lay press, numerical and mathematical reasoning, and then problem solving, and then I'll finish up with what has been referred to, again, in the lay press as savant skills. So in language, and again, what I'm going to do here is sort of give you a number of different references and sort of describe them in very crude sort of thumbnail sketches. If you are interested in that primary literature, I leave the references up here for you as well. But just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that's been done. And we can talk about some specific studies in more detail if that's something that interests you. But a number of studies involving both TMS and tDCS have shown that these technologies can be used to enhance language performance and in some cases language acquisition. So for instance, both technologies have been used now for a number of studies over the years have shown that they can be used to enhance naming and actually speed the ability to name things in a sort of confrontational manner. You show them the thing, then they come up with the right name. tDCS a few years ago was employed to speed the acquisition of both novel names and novel grammar forms. So this is actually the same research group. What they did was, in two separate studies, they created novel words for things, right? Novel labels for things, and people had to learn these new labels, and they found that they were able to do them more rapidly, sort of acquire that skill in the context of getting tDCS while they were training to do it. In a related study, they actually created a new grammar structure, right? These are sort of psycholinguists and people who work with language a lot. They created a new grammar structure, and the task was to learn this new grammar, and they found that individuals who were getting tDCS over the left hemisphere, for most of us, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, right? That they were able to better acquire the novel grammar in the context of stimulation. And other investigators have found that tDCS can be used to increase verbal fluency, right? The rate, the rhythm, the flow of speech. Just to show you a little bit of homespun work. So a couple of years ago, we reported that tDCS could be used at least transiently to improve reading efficiency. So what's going on is there's a standardized test of reading ability for words, non-words, that measures both accuracy and the efficiency with which individuals are reading. And I realize the print's a little small here, but what we're demonstrating on this standardized measure, which is called the Tower test, is that individuals who received stimulation, in this case, over an area that's associated with reading ability, this would be the left hemisphere, again, sort of left hemisphere language dominance, and this time a little bit more posterior, the angular gyrus, that they had an overall increase in reading efficiency in the context of receiving stimulation during this task. Interestingly, so this is a sort of heat map, excuse me, a heat map of computer modeling of where we think the current is going. You see that it's sort of focused in the area of the angular gyrus on that left hemisphere. And interestingly, what ended up being the case, aside from the entire cohort showing an improvement, if we looked at the people, this is all normal subjects, if we looked at the subjects who started out on the sort of lower half of the bell curve of performance, just for this cohort, right? They're all normal. So this is still normal performance. It's just the lower half of the bell curve for that cohort. Every single member in the lower half of that cohort showed an improvement. It's extremely consistent results across individuals who just even within the normal population started out somewhat weaker in the context of a group of normal readers. There have been a number of studies in which tDCS has been used to enhance, at least transiently, and I'll show you some data on more enduring effects, but at least transiently enhance different aspects of learning. So it's been used to enhance phonological memory. I'll show you a slide in a moment showing that tDCS has been used, and TMS as well, has been used to enhance the acquisition of certain motor skills. And in work that I think is some of the better known work with respect to tDCS and learning, tDCS has been used to improve verbal working memory. So this is performance on a working memory task. So, this particular task is something called an NBAC task. And again, I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with specific cognitive measures. So forgive me for patronizing you if I explain to you something that you already know, but an NBAC task is a task in which subjects are shown serially a number of stimuli, in this case letters, and what they're supposed to report is whether or not a letter has been repeated in this serial presentation. The reason it's called an NBAC task is because you can make the task harder by asking them to recall whether an item that has been repeated more than one item ago has been repeated, right? So you can say, well, how about the item 2 items ago? That would be an N of 2. So was that repeated? And you can make it even harder. How about the item 3 items ago? And so then this task goes on and on. So for each item, the subject has to remember, let's make it a 2-back task, what the item was 2 objects ago. Right, so this is a pretty difficult task. You can see that normal subjects who received tDCS had an improvement in their correct responses. All right, so this is that motor learning task that I had alluded to, and I think that this is one of the most sort of demonstrative studies with respect to acquisition of some skill being enhanced using non-invasive brain stimulation. It's often referred to by people who do this kind of work in non-invasive brain stimulation. So what this group did was that they had this complex motor task. So the way this works is kind of like a video game almost, so that the person has to take this little cursor, and there's a force transducer here, and as you squeeze the force transducer, that pushes this little black square over. All right? And so what they have to do is they have to go back and forth, and they have to go back and forth between these color bars back to home. So first they have to go out to the red one, then back, then out to the purple over here, then back, then out to the green, then back, then out to the blue, then back, then out to this little guy, and then back, right? And do as quickly as they can in the right order. Right? So it's actually a pretty hard task to do. And so these subjects were trained to do this, and they received tDCS, or they didn't, during their training, and they received tDCS over the motor cortex, over the motor part of their brain. And we know that this is the case because they actually stimulated that motor section with TMS. Remember I told you that TMS can cause depolarization of neurons. So they stimulate over the part that represents the hand, and the hand jumps, and they're like, okay, we found it. So now they stick the tDCS on there, and they train people to do this task while they're getting tDCS for 5 days. So what you can see is that the acquisition of the task is more robust in the individuals who are getting tDCS compared to the individuals who were not getting tDCS, right? And the individuals who are getting sham stimulation. And I think for our purposes, in terms of talking about cognitive enhancement or enhancement of performance, the important slide or the important illustration is right here, right? So this is the measure of performance on this task far out from having actually done the training. So these are days out from the completion of training. This is day 85 after completion of training, right? And you can still see a big separation between the individuals who received tDCS while they were acquiring this skill versus the individuals who did not. All right, shifting gears somewhat to another domain of cognition that has received a lot of attention in the press. I don't know if you're following non-invasive brain stimulation as a way to enhance cognition at all in the literature. You may have heard of the next couple of studies by Roy Cohen-Kadosh and colleagues. And this deals with whether or not non-invasive brain stimulation can be used to enhance what has been referred to as numeric competence, or you can think of it more broadly as mathematical ability. And so in a study a couple of years ago, what this group did was they invented some artificial symbols, right? So these aren't real numbers. I hope you can see. I know it's pretty small, but they basically made fake number-like symbols and taught them to people and taught people the relative values of these fake symbols. So this symbol is bigger than this symbol. It was worth more than this symbol. It was worth more than this symbol, and so on and so forth, right? So, and they did this either with stimulation or with sham stimulation. And what they could demonstrate was that after you received real stimulation, I'll talk you through it since obviously these graphs are completely incomprehensible from the distance that you're at. So let me just talk you through it. So what they found was that with stimulation of the right anodal, left cathodal stimulation of the parietal cortex, that these individuals started to treat these symbols as numbers more avidly. And the way they tested this was two ways. One way was something called a numeric Stroop task. For those of you not familiar with what a Stroop task is, it involves the idea of interference between two sources of information. So a very typical way of setting up a Stroop task would be, say, if you had words for colors, right? So black, blue, brown, whatever, and the words were printed in different colored ink, and you were supposed to say what color the ink was. But as you were trying to do that, you're reading the words, sort of, you can't help yourself, and there's a sort of natural tendency to go with what the word says in print as opposed to what the color is. That would be an example of a Stroop task. The degree of interference you experience there that's what the Stroop task is getting at. Okay? And so a numeric Stroop task is one in which items, presumably numbers or number-like objects, are given to you simultaneously at different sizes, right? And you're supposed to say which of these is worth more, right? Worth more, which is the higher number, right? So there's a conflict. If a large number, physically large number, is smaller in value than a small number, right? Or than, a physically small number. Let's say you have a big 2 and a tiny 9, right? That's going to be a source of interference because you kind of want to go with what's big. You want it to, you want it to be big in both ways simultaneously, right? And so what they found was that the individuals who had received stimulation treated these objects that they had been taught had values, they treated them in a more number-like fashion. They got more of that numeric Stroop interference than the individuals who had either stimulation in a different configuration or sham. Another way they looked at this, sort of interestingly, is they made individuals put these objects on a line. They had them construct a number line, right? So based on your understanding of what these are worth, just put them on a line. And to make a long story short, it turns out that children tend to put numbers along a number line in a certain way before they acquire number concepts, or the concept of numbers being at regular intervals along a number line. And then after we sort of master that numeric concept, we tend to put the numbers in a number line linearly. Right? And so individuals who hadn't had this stimulation tended to treat these number-like objects more the way children do before they understand what numbers are all about, whereas the individuals who received stimulation while learning about the numberness of these objects tended to put the numbers in the number line the way that we would understand numbers. Does that make sense in a sort of broad sense? So in some ways, this I think of as a follow-up study. In some ways, follow-up in the sense that, well, that's great, but these are all fake numbers, right? What about real-world math? What about actually working with numbers? So although this is a stimulation of a somewhat different area of the brain, this is the same group, different first author, same group, and basically what they did was they taught individuals to drill on 2 different types of calculation tasks, or what they call one was a calculation task and the other was a drill task. So drilling would be like things that you memorize, like your times tables, stuff like that. Calculations would be sort of problems where you couldn't predict, you don't know every single iteration of that kind of problem, like 59 minus 7, or 7 minus 3, or 37 minus 9. You don't memorize all those. Right? When they come up, you calculate them as opposed to 6 times 5, right? That you've just got memorized. So what they found was that with stimulation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, using a related technology, and I'll take a quick detour here, transcranial random noise stimulation. If you are planning to follow this literature, I'll just say that you will hear more about this technology in the future. There's just not a whole lot to report right now, but you will hear more about this. It is a technology related to tDCS, in which what's going on is you're actually giving sort of random oscillations or random frequency current instead of direct current. So in some ways it's like alternating current instead of direct current, except you're giving it a sort of this random oscillating frequency. At any rate, it has some of the same effects as other forms of current on the brain. And so what they found was that for both of these kinds of tasks, drilling and calculation, that subjects were performed better, were faster at developing their skills and performed better during stimulation. However, they found that in terms of long-term effects, persistence, when they tested weeks later, that it was the subjects who had received stimulation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that these subjects had an increase, an improvement in their performance only with respect to this sort of more flexible calculation type of task. Remember that these subjects are being stimulated in the frontal lobe. So these subjects stimulated in the frontal lobe have this persistent effect with their calculation or with their performance of these calculations rather than their sort of rote drilling. Again, and I'm sorry that this has a sort of smorgasbord tour de force kind of feel, but shifting gears again, there's been some work, and it actually spans some length of time. There's been some work looking at the effects of brain stimulation on spatial attention. And I want to highlight one study in particular in normal individuals that actually dates from a number of years ago. And in this study, TMS, this is repetitive TMS, was delivered at a frequency that is thought to be inhibitory in nature. We didn't go over all the details of which types of TMS are inhibitory, which types are facilitative, but let's say that low frequency repetitive stimulation is thought to be inhibitory in nature, given over the right parietal cortex, and what these subjects were subjected to was an extinction task, that is presentation of double simultaneous stimuli. So two things appear on the screen at once, you have to say, well, or one thing might, but when two appear, you're supposed to indicate that both have appeared. And what they found was that individuals who had inhibition of that right hemisphere, the right parietal cortex, which, as an aside, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, is thought to have some important role in processing space, in particular space on the contralateral side, the left side of space. So what they found is when they inhibited that, they actually induced extinction of contralateral targets. So people were worse at figuring out when two things had been presented simultaneously. They tended to ignore what was going on over here. Concurrently, they tended to be much better at finding the target when the target was on the ipsilateral side of space. Okay? And the reason why I point to this particular study is because it, first of all, shows that you can modulate and in some ways improve some aspects of visual spatial processing. But it also highlights a potential threat, right, a potential concern about brain stimulation, that perhaps in modulating some function, you're doing it at the expense of another. And so we'll sort of come back to that, because this is at least one manuscript where something got better, but conversely, something else became worse. So there have been a number of different investigations looking at different aspects of frontal lobe function. It itself, within my smorgasbord presentation, it's its own smorgasbord. So we can't go over them all, but it includes tests of impulse control, different aspects of cognitive control, and creativity. Let me just go over a couple of studies. One, because I think it has such potential salience to the real world and concerns that lots of cognitively normal people have, and that is the relationship between sort of cognitive control, impulse control, and your ability to abstain from activities and actions that might be deleterious for you, for example, overeating. Right? And so this is a study in which prefrontal cortex transcranial direct current stimulation was used to actually reduce the food cravings of individuals who reported having certain cravings for unhealthful foods. Right? And so what they found was that after individuals were stimulated, they reported a reduction in their desire for these foods and an increase in their subjective sense that they would be able to refuse them if they were presented with them. Right? And so again, something sort of touches on a concern, and for I think a lot of people who would be deemed cognitively normal, right? The ability to modulate your desires for things that at least some part of you says you shouldn't be overindulging in. This is a different kind of frontal lobe function study. Again, a little bit of homespun data, if you don't mind us sort of selling our wares here. This is a paper that's about to come out. This is Leela Krisikou, is a postdoctoral fellow for Sharon Thompson-Schill here in the CCN, who's now moved on. But what she was interested in was whether or not we could inhibit the function of the frontal lobe, sort of free it to some extent from a certain amount of cognitive control, and whether that would enable certain abilities. In particular, the ability that she was looking at was the ability to generate a novel use for a common object, right? And so that requires a little bit of thinking outside the box, right? So for instance, you look at this big clunky shoe and you say, well, what else could this be? Well, gosh, I guess I could use it as a hammer to hammer in nails, or maybe a bird could use it as a nest, or I don't know, I could drill, I could potentially drink something. I don't know, I could use it for a number of different reasons, right? Requires some thinking outside the box, and what they found was that, what we found, I should say, is that when there was inhibition, cathodal stimulation of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, individuals were much quicker at generating some type of new out-of-the-box function for these common objects, right? And also we're more likely, generally speaking, to come up with some out-of-the-box function, right? The number of response omissions also decreased, right? Again, speaking to this idea that it's keep in mind that this is inhibition, right? You're inhibiting that frontal area. You might imagine that there might be some trade-off there with respect to inhibiting the frontal lobes that doesn't just equate to a pure gain with respect to your creativity coming up with novel uses for common objects. And this segues nicely, I think, into another area of what I can think of as a type of creativity, and that is the idea of insight. This is work done by a number of people, including locally here by John Cunios at Drexel University, we're working on a tDCS project together on this very topic. But that insight is this idea of sudden realization of the answer to some problem that you're trying to solve that is in the absence of laborious analytical processing, right? Instead of sort of churning through what the answers are, it's like the skies open up, something touches you on the head, and you sort of realize what the answer is, right? Everyone's had this sort of, aha, that's what we should be doing. So this kind of thinking, it turns out, can be manipulated with non-invasive brain stimulation. So this is a paper from a few years ago in which tDCS of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was used to, in my clinical training keeps coming out, in normal subjects who were performing these remote association tests. So that's where you're given a series of words, and the words are all united by some other word, but the words themselves bear no logical relationship to each other. So, for instance, you got the words scan, wash, and child. Those words don't bear any rational relationship to one another, sort of unifying theme, unless you think of the word brain, right? So you can have a brain scan, you can brainwash someone, something can be your brainchild. So that's the idea behind these remote association tasks. Okay? And it tends to be the case that people either sort of churn through the answers or that it just sort of comes to them. Right? And so they found that with anodal stimulation of the frontal lobes, these answers are more likely to come to people. This is another kind of insight problem. Alan Snyder has made something of a cottage industry. We'll talk about him in a little bit, of demonstrating that non-invasive brain stimulation can be used to really facilitate aspects of cognition. And so in this particular task, it's a different kind of insight problem where individuals are asked to make equations that make sense out of matchsticks. Right? So it's not strictly a math problem, it's sort of a puzzle where there's a tendency to sort of, for the answer to sort of come to you or to not, right? As you're sort of trying to churn through how a series of matchsticks can be corrected. This is an incorrect statement, how it could be manipulated in subtle ways to make a correct statement. And what they found was that if you stimulated with tDCS, that you can increase the likelihood over time that someone would come up with the correct solution to this problem, right? So compared to one orientation of stimulation or a sham stimulation, that individuals were much more likely to come up with the correct sort of insight-based solution, which is represented here in terms, it's a little confusing, it's represented in terms of percentage of subjects who've not yet solved the problem, right? So this is actually our tDCS group, right? More of them have solved it over time than individuals receiving sham stimulation. So again, I alluded to Alan Snyder, who's a real enthusiast about the idea of using non-invasive brain stimulation to enhance normal thinking. So it's big on the idea of enhancing, bringing out so-called savant skills. So this, you may remember this, for those of you who've been paying attention to this kind of literature from a few years back. This is from 2003, in which TMS of the anterior temporal pole. This is again, this is inhibitory stimulation. He used this stimulation and argued, although looking at these samples, I don't know. You sort of judge for yourself how the veracity of these claims, that he could bring out people's artistic abilities, that he could sort of bring out our sort of artistic savant-like skills by inhibiting the function of the temporal lobe. So here, for instance, are individuals drawing, I believe, cats. So this is a cat. So this is before TMS. I don't know, it's a little fuzzy here, but I mean, that's a pretty bad cat. I'll agree with that. And yeah, okay, maybe it gets a little bit better, a little more representational. I mean, to me, it looks like a sort of a sleeping ferret. But yeah, I mean, the argument here is that the representations become more subtle. I'm not sure, but it is the case that he followed it up with a number of other studies as well, showing different areas in which people's latent abilities, if you will, this domain seem to be improved by inhibiting the temporal pole. Again, sort of reported improvement in drawing skills, improved self-reporting of visual details when they're analyzing a visual environment, an improvement in proofreading, sort of the ability to search for unusual mistakes and things like that, sort of scanning a written environment, as well as numerosity judgments, the ability to sort of look at a bunch of things and tell you how many things there were. And so this all fits into what he had put forth as a hypothesis of diminished anterior temporal lobe function. So we do know that the temporal lobes have a lot to do with semantic processing, sort of how you put together information and concepts in the world. And so the basic idea, just to sort of gloss over a lot of what he says and to boil it down to a sort of concise overgeneralization. But the basic idea is that if you can inhibit the temporal lobes, you sort of wash away some of your preconceptions of what you were looking at, and you're able to look at these things with somewhat fresher eyes. A comparison in the real world, or from what's known in sort of the much older cognitive science, would be if you're trying to draw a figure. I don't know if any of you have ever done this. Sort of try to draw, copy a figure, and you do it right side up, and then you turn the figure around, and you try to copy it upside down, right? And it turns out that you're much more accurate at copying the figure when you turn it upside down compared to right side up. And the argument is that it's because when you're trying to draw a figure right side up, you have all these preconceived notions about how body parts should be shaped and how things are sort of relate to one another, and that you're not really seeing the object as it is, right? And that you sort of free yourself from that when you turn it upside down. So that's sort of the equivalent of this argument, whether you buy it or not. But certainly they've done a number of studies sort of arguing that people are released from some of these preconceptions with inhibitory TMS. Oops, skip the slide. I should also mention, although this is not a clinical talk, that non-invasive brain stimulation really only has one FDA-approved indication. That is, TMS is now approved for stimulation and treatment of patients with refractory depression, so medication refractory depression. And so there's now a fair amount of evidence demonstrating that this works to some extent in patients who have failed at least one medication treatment. So it's now part of an armamentarium that psychiatrists use to treat depression. Importantly, you can also demonstrate that TMS can have some mood-related effects in normal individuals, right? And so we know that it can be used to such an extent that it actually affects clinically depressed individuals. So there's reason to suspect that with repeated use and with the right protocols, that it actually can affect the mood of healthy individuals after stimulation potentially as well. It's being explored for a number of other clinical indications: OCD, PTSD, schizophrenia. tDCS is also being explored as a potential treatment for depression. I should mention that the indication for TMS for depression is actually for a specific protocol for a specific coil maker. So this is a sort of proprietary material. So NeuroStar is a particular stimulator. And so when you stimulate for depression, they stimulate with the NeuroStar system. A second specific device has recently been approved. And so then finally, in our promise section, TMS and tDCS have been used to manipulate what can be thought of as social cognition. Basically, to manipulate mechanisms of cognition that affect our behaviors with respect to one another. And so here, I'll focus on three particular areas: bias and prejudice, altruism and self-interest, and deception. And I think obviously the ability to manipulate these kinds of interpersonal relationships raises its own ethical questions. So here's an example of altruism, and, to some extent what one might think of as moral judgments. So this is work from, as you can see, a few years ago, and it involves what's called altruistic punishment. So altruistic punishment is this. So if I say to you, all right, well, you've got a friend here or someone that I'm going to give money to, and that person's job is to split that money whatever way they see fit. Right? And split it between you and them, and they'll keep some of it and you'll keep some of it. And your job is to either accept the offer or to reject the offer. Right? So I'm going to give person A $20. Person A's got to decide what the split is. Your job is just to decide whether or not you're going to take their offer. And if you don't take the offer, nobody gets anything. Okay? So if you make that kind of proposition to a person, it turns out that there is a ratio of bad offer where people will just reject the offer. Nobody gets it. Nobody wins. When it gets to about 4 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, you'd rather say no. Even if the amount of money, if I say, all right, well, person A, I'm giving you $1 million. I'm giving you some large amount of money. Well, maybe not $1 million, but responders will reject offers as high as 3 times their monthly income, some ridiculous amount of money. Right? They'll say, all right, well, yeah, I realize that I'll get this amount, but you are getting so much that is so unfair that's it. I'm shutting this game down. Right? That's altruistic punishment. You don't benefit, but you think that the situation is so unfair you don't want anyone to benefit. Okay? It turns out that this behavior is associated with activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that when you sense that the setup is unfair, that you get activation in that center. And so if you apply inhibitory stimulation to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, guess what? People start to take the offers, right? And think about it from this perspective. From a certain perspective, it's irrational to refuse the offer, right? I mean, a rational actor, a purely rational actor, would take the offer no matter what, right? Because if they say no, then they don't get anything. So why would they say no ever, right? It turns out that if you inhibit that center, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that you can actually get people to be more accepting of the offers, if you will, sort of less controlling with respect to their altruistic punishment. It's been demonstrated with tDCS as well. And although we don't have time to discuss it, TMS and tDCS of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex have been shown to manipulate performance on a number of other types of risk-taking, addiction cravings. I showed you some of this work with obesity or with food cravings. So it's also been shown that you can use non-invasive brain stimulation to inform deception, or what's known about deception. So for instance, you can generate what's called a TMS-invoked motor evoked potential, right? So I alluded to it once before. You can sort of hit the motor part of the brain and you can demonstrate a motor response. Well, it turns out that those motor responses are manipulated by all sorts of things. Sort of cognitive processes, all sorts of things. You can demonstrate some difference in that motor response, that output from TMS. And that it turns out that if you're forcing people to say deceitful things versus truthful things, that you actually get larger MEPs during the deceit than you get during the truth-telling. Right? So in some ways, the TMS is now being used in this particular study as a lie detector, right? As you're getting an increased signal when someone isn't telling the truth. You can also demonstrate that using something called the guilty knowledge test, is another sort of test of deception, that if you apply tDCS over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that you will get increased response times for false answers compared to truthful answers. So the false answers sort of sort themselves out in terms of how long it takes for you to come up with one compared to a truthful answer in the context of brain stimulation. So, what does this mean? I mean, we can manipulate cognition in a variety of different domains. Is this the sort of burgeoning new frontier? We're going to step into an age where people are going to become, like the $6 million man, stronger, faster, better, as a result of getting brain stimulation. Well, maybe it's happening already. So, not to focus on one specific company, I just thought they had the glossiest presentation. I was immediately drawn to this website. But it's one of a number of different companies that you can now go to buy your own transcranial direct current stimulator. You should wear it. This one in particular I love because it's advertised as a headset for video gamers, right? So that you can play acquire those motor skills it requires to play your video games better. They say that you can overclock your head. Which I guess is some game player slang. Anyhow, it comes complete with the ability to control it with an iPad or with your iPhone. Also, attractive modeling. So it's sort of out there, right? I mean, it's in the lay literature. It's out on the internet. Somewhat scary. People are actually making these devices in their own garage, right? You can download diagrams, circuit diagrams of how you would create your own tDCS device. It doesn't take that much know-how. It doesn't take that much money. You could go to Radio Shack with a $100 bill and then go into your garage for a couple days and come out with a basic tDCS unit, which is clearly what's happening in many parts of the world, right? And so people are stimulating themselves. You should try this sometime. Not stimulating yourself. You should try going onto YouTube and entering search for do-it-yourself tDCS. You'll find at least 10 videos of people showing you how to build a stimulator and how to stimulate yourself, right? So at least some aspect of this future in which people are hoping to improve their own cognition is here already. And so it's worthwhile talking about some of the implications. And so, at least in my mind, and I'll remind you that I'm a clinician, so I freely admit that some of my thinking around this is guided and highly influenced by principles of medical ethics. I sort of think of some of the perils of brain stimulation in terms of safety, character, justice, and autonomy, where in terms of safety, the technologies are very safe. We talked about that already, but it's worthwhile knowing that they're out there. So for TMS, there are some hypothetical risks. The principal risk that we need to talk about is seizure induction. Again, like I said, within the currently published parameters, TMS is pretty safe with respect to that. And to date, there are no known serious risks associated with tDCS. But in the back of your mind, when you're thinking about the implementation of these technologies on a large-scale basis, potentially with relatively little controls, obviously safety has to be an important concern. I should mention that while safety is an important problem, at least from the perspective of clinician, it's a very familiar problem. We know about this problem with respect to other types of treatments, with respect to other kinds of things that people do to modulate their health and their well-being, right? And so concerns about safety are ubiquitous to any therapeutic or cosmetic intervention. And so one important concept to keep in mind is what's called the risk-benefit ratio, right? Is the benefit that individuals are gaining from this particular intervention worth the risk of having it? There are, and in this regard, I should mention, there isn't a whole lot of conflict of interest. And this isn't one of these sort of Gordian knot kinds of ethical problems, because to our knowledge, everyone's invested in this being safe. Right? The device makers don't want people to start seizing in the streets. The people who are using it don't want to have an adverse outcome. And I certainly don't want to have anyone to have an adverse outcome. Everyone's goals are sort of aligned with respect to safety. So in that way, it's one of our simpler problems. There are, I think, some theoretical risks of altering brain activity that need to be discussed that are perhaps a little bit different than other kinds of medical or surgical interventions. For instance, there's the possibility of unintended cognitive consequences. So this is a mobile by Calder. I don't know if people remember this artist. Was a big mobile builder. And the basic idea here is that brains are really intricately balanced things, right? It's a balance of 100 billion little operating systems. And if you start to tweak them in sort of poorly controlled ways or ways that you're not certain what's going to happen, you could affect the balance of abilities. I showed you at least one paper where, yes, okay, you gained an ability to detect targets in one part of space, but you kind of degraded it in another. It's time and investigation will tell whether or not specific manipulations in one domain have effects in others that right now are not being adequately investigated or revealed. Another theoretical risk that's at least worth touching upon is the idea that unlike surgery or for I don't know, something orthopedic, or if you have a hernia or any other type of medical intervention, when you are talking about exogenously applying electrical or magnetic energy to the brain in order to focally manipulate its function, you are talking about modulating the function of the engine of your being, right? You are talking about exogenously potentially altering critical aspects of your identity and selfhood. Now, I mean, I don't want to blow this way out of proportion, right? I mean, it's not like we're taking people and turning them into zombies and robots by virtue of doing non-invasive brain stimulation, but we are demonstrating that you can have enduring effects on certain cognitive abilities. And what are you other than the aggregate of your cognitive and sort of intellectual and social abilities, right? So insofar as you can manipulate these things, potentially on an enduring basis, it's worth thinking of that as one of the potential theoretical risks of doing brain stimulation, especially, by the way, if you combine this with that, right? Unintended consequences that affect identity and selfhood from focal manipulation of the brain. With respect to character, there's another concern. It's sort of a much more broad concern, sort of broad-based concern, and that is that, you know, these technologies could potentially make certain cognitive tasks, certain things that you're trying to accomplish easier, right? As you sort of artificially amp up your certain cognitive domains and abilities. And so this sort of touches upon issues of identity and what I think of meaning. You know, we don't think about it much, but a very deep theme in society is this idea that struggling, working, in some cases suffering, has its value, right? That, I mean, it's sort of borne out in a number of sayings that we're all familiar with, right? No pain, no gain. That which does not kill you makes you stronger. I like the military one, pain is just weakness leaving the body. This idea that there's some strengthening value, right? Something that adds to your integrity and moral character by virtue of being able to endure and persist. And so the question is, well, what if we just have technologies that make it easier for us to do anything? I mean, your mood's a little bit low. Okay, well, you get ramped up a little bit in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We'll fix you right up. And you have a problem with that math test, you don't need to study as hard. We'll just, you know, stick some parietal tDCS. You're good to go. I mean, you know, this has some potential for affecting judgments. Yet on the other hand, it certainly isn't the case that we aren't absolute about this. I mean, there are certain pains and certain sufferings which we say, well, obviously it's not worthwhile to necessarily undergo this if you don't want to. And you know, the whole field of anesthesia is based around that concept, right? And so you know, is there a balance point, and are we modulating that by therapies that allow us to do things more easily than we otherwise would have? Justice. You know, here I think, again, as a clinician, this is some pretty familiar territory. There aren't any therapies or anything that we administer in medicine, at least, where there isn't some inequity involved. I mean, it's just the way of the world, or in the words of William Gibson, you know, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, right? I mean, there are those who receive and those who do not. And certainly that could be true as individuals are exploring stimulation for cosmetic purposes, intellectually cosmetic purposes, with TMS or tDCS, right? We could end up with a society in which there is boutique cognitive enhancement for wealthy individuals, whereas other people are left behind. But again, in some ways, this mirrors existing problems. It's and at least in my mind, as you could see from the slide with the people who went out to Radio Shack and started building their own stimulators for $100, this problem might actually be less of a problem than things like drugs and antibodies and treatments that cost thousands of dollars. If you can go out to, you know, again, if you can build one for yourself for 50 or $100. I don't know if that's a good solution, but it does suggest that maybe there's a difference in the absolute inequity or the ability to be exposed to these technologies. Then there's the issue of autonomy. And here we've given some thought to the idea of hard and soft coercion, right? Where hard coercion, I don't need to tell you guys, but you know, it's the idea of explicitly forcing people to do something for potentially the greater good of a society. And so there are certainly cases, legal cases and cases that we know from, say, prisoners in this country, other places, where the military, where people are forced to do things that may be in line with what they're interested in doing, that may not be, with respect to modulating their aspects of their cognition. Think about amphetamines for soldiers, to keep them alert. Think about medical treatments to diminish sexual drive in certain prison populations. Things have been done to modulate cognition and behavior in certain populations. So the risk of coercion is a potentially real one. Oh, also, one has to consider, in that slide I showed you about the uses of non-invasive brain stimulation as potential lie detectors, the possibility that there might be forced revelation of one's cognitive states. But then there's also the problem of soft coercion. So here we're talking about more implicit demands to gain a competitive advantage in our society. And this sort of insidious form of coercion is certainly a very powerful one in our society, right? The idea that if you're not running as fast as you can to get better and smarter and faster, you're just falling behind while everyone else is racing to get ahead. Right? And this could certainly have an impact. So for example, think of professional sports where there's this enormous pressure for people to improve. Well, guess what? In a technology where you can demonstrate that people have increased acquisition and better performance of motor skills, right? It's a potential concern. Think about stimulants that are being used like Ritalin by professionals and by students to enhance their cognition and alertness. You can imagine that non-invasive brain stimulation could eventually fill a niche in this soft coercion environment. I've been, I think, a little bit doom and gloom and a little bit scary about these concerns. And in the past, I've been reprimanded by manuscript critics who remind me that, we should focus also on the idea that people are free to do these things, right? So I did want to throw in at least one slide that emphasizes that while I could see potential problems, there has to be some balance between this sort of wariness and a respect for people's autonomy to pursue various actions that one considers to be useful and advisable for one's health, whether that be sort of the health of one's body or one's cognitive abilities, right? So there is a balance point to be had, and I personally am not advocating for sort of a martial law moratorium on brain stimulation, but rather that there's a balance to be had with respect to these concerns. So then what is to be done? What are some of the next steps? I really think that one of the first next steps is something like this, right? So increasing awareness about issues and about the potential of these technologies and what's plausible and what isn't, as they emerge. There are lessons to be drawn, in my opinion, from other types of elective self-enhancement. And so we have to sort of look at these other cases and see what seems applicable, what seems discordant, what's useful, what's not, from cases like cosmetic surgery, right, which it has a long storied history of sort of self-enhancement from an origin that was much more clinical to something that is now much more geared at really treating people who have no medical or diagnosable disorder, but want to improve themselves in physical ways. And also cosmetic neurology outside of the realm of non-invasive brain stimulation. So we talked a little bit about neurostimulants, and people taking medications to enhance their cognition. Those cases also have a lot to inform us about what directions we should be going in with respect to non-invasive brain stimulation. I personally think, I said it before in a different, somewhat tongue-in-cheek way, I don't think monolithic policies are likely to be useful moving forward. I don't think it makes sense to make bans. I don't think it makes sense to sort of to be pushing these technologies on people. But I do think that as these technologies become more and more popular, as it becomes more and more realistic that individuals will attempt to use them, there is a fiduciary responsibility on the part of experts in this field, people who use it either clinically or for experimental purposes, to educate the public. And so on some level, public education and with respect to at least safety and usage, maybe public policy considerations are going to be necessary moving forward. Right? And so I think there's this sort of cycle of educating ourselves and then sort of educating the public about what is rational, reasonable, safe as we move towards brain stimulation. All right, so I just want to thank the members of the Laboratory for Cognition and Neural Stimulation, also a number of colleagues. I'll mention in particular individuals who I've co-authored a couple of manuscripts related to non-invasive brain stimulation and medical and cosmetic ethics, so including Anjan Chatterjee, who you'll hear from, also Samuel Messing, Emily Evans at the Perelman School of Medicine, and Laura Cabrera, who's at the University of British Columbia National Core for Neuroethics. Love to take your questions.